Hey,
We're
look at
live.
that. Hey,
Calling
welcome.
Chris Anderson in Luxembourg.
How did you know? Because it looks exactly like it did the last time I was in
Wait, if this
Luxembourg.
is Sunday, it must be
It must be
Luxembourg. I
Luxembourg.
don't know,
Yeah,
something like that.
calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Here, present and accounted for. And we're gonna have we're having one of those two continent, three country shows. I mean, they're all two
Right?
continent shows. Almost all of them have been, but we have three different countries today. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Wherever Chris and I go, they make us come back on Sunday afternoons to be with you. It's a wrenched arm behind the back, but we come and we do it. No, we love it.
No.
And have a cocktail, talk about history. And today we're going to be talking about Lord Charles Cornwallis, who many of you know from the American Revolution, but there's a lot more to the story.
Absolutely.
And Chris, we should say a big thank you to
should.
everyone who supports us via Patreon, especially our
Absolutely.
top shelf supporters. And we had a new top shelf supporter
did.
this week, and Ron Dries. And if
Hey.
I'm correct, we now have 19 top shelf supporters. So if we
Look at
got
that.
one more, they could be the top shelf 20.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Somebody's got to step up to have a top shelf 20, and you can do it by
Weird.
going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour if you know that's kind of what's
If you're so
important to
inclined.
us. And a reminder that you can find out about upcoming shows on our website, historyhappyhour.net. Chris, is anybody watching? Do we have anybody out there?
We have a great turnout so far. Thomas Benner from West Virginia, Emily and Tom from West Virginia, Doreen's joining us again, Lynn, Rick Fry, Skip Cornett, Doug McCord, a whole bunch of people.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks. And a lot of people are saying it's hot where they are. So we hear that it's
Yeah.
hot in Europe too and getting hotter.
And getting hotter.
Kind of like History Happy Hour. So,
Oh boy, that was bad.
okay. Are we ready to
I think so.
stop with the silliness and get going?
Yeah, I think so.
Give me the cue.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Chris, we probably know, I think most of us in America, Lord Cornwallis for surrendering to George Washington at Yorktown. Sorry about that, but historical fact. Yes, surrendering his army to George Washington at Yorktown, and thus essentially bringing about the end of the American Revolution. But there's a whole lot more to the story of Cornwallis, both the American part of his military activities as well as what happens afterwards. And we're going to talk about that today with the author of the first new biography of Lord Cornwallis in 40 years, Richard Middleton. It's titled Cornwallis. Richard, I like that. I like the simple titling. Just like I
Right.
title everything I write, The Ghost Army. Oh, got that in early. Pretty easy to understand. Welcome to History Happy Hour.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the
Thanks for
invitation.
joining us.
Yeah, we've come in for some criticism in the past few weeks for neglecting to share the cocktails that people may or may not be drinking. Did you bring a cocktail to join us this week, Richard?
Well, I have it's a non-alcoholic one. It's water and a mixture of apple juice and what is it? Anyhow, apple juice. Yeah, so it's refreshing.
Stumping
Yeah.
you on the first question.
Mango juice. Sorry, my brain is already threatening to seize up.
Chris, what about yourself?
I'm on the job, so
I,
I'm getting ready for a hot day tomorrow. Touring and all that.
I have a nice glass of port, and I'm thinking about the Empire.
wow.
I'm harumphing about the Empire. in
Good
the
for you.
Harumph.
Good for you.
Richard, Cornwallis surrenders to Washington at Yorktown, which one might have thought would kind of ruin his reputation back home. And so I think a lot of people would be surprised to find that when he died 25 years later, he was mourned in Britain as a national hero. How do you pull off a comeback like that?
Well, with a little help from his friends and I suppose good fortune, he didn't. He came out of the American War. He was popular with the army. he was respected by both his officers and the common soldiers. I think all of them, they appreciated his readiness to get stuck into the enemy, as it were, to try and bring the war to a conclusion one way or another. So that was a big advantage, I think, for him. Also, a lot of other people came in for blame for losing the American War, notably the ministry headed by Lord North and the very unpopular Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the America. Lord Sandwich, yes, the ministry, they took the majority of the blame. And then, of course, a lot of other people, if they were in the army or criticisms of the generals, it tended to be Clinton who got the criticism. Also, Sir William Howe, the previous commander-in-chief, who had squandered the best opportunity for bringing the war to a successful conclusion. He had the largest army collection of men and materials, and he hasn't been successful in making the kind of impression that was expected. So I think for all these things, Cornwallis wasn't blamed for the war or for Yorktown.
Richard, I think for most Americans, Cornwallis is this figure that engages in some battles in the South, and then obviously is forced to surrender at Yorktown, and then he kind of disappears. But there's an awful lot more to him than that. And then just to kind of place this person in a better context and give American viewers a better idea of who he was, talk a little bit about his background and how he finds himself in the position that he's in.
Perhaps going forward, I would just say very briefly, as he comes back from America in early 1782, already the ministry are viewing him as a possible candidate for a job in India as Governor General. He takes that job, but that is, as we'll perhaps come on to the discussion, was quite successful, I think. And then he comes back. He's in the Pitt's cabinet fighting the war against the French revolutionaries, and then he seems to be the man who can solve the problems of Ireland, which breaks out into rebellion. So it's a long and distinguished career, and right at the end of his life, he volunteers to go back to India to redeem once again a crumbling situation there. So that's the overall. That's why he's in 1806 when he dies. He's thought to have been a national hero. He had served with distinction in India and in the British cabinet in Ireland, etc. So, well, going back to his origins, he's an aristocrat. He's the first of the eldest son of the first Earl Cornwallis. And the family itself, interesting enough, traces its origins. They like to imply that the origin of the family and the name Cornwallis is from Cornwall, and they do their coat of arms. They do have it's a species of bird in the Cornwall area. They have that on the coat of arms, but I think in fact Cornwallis or Cornwallis was a name that was also known in Ireland, and that seems to be, they clearly did have at one point, very early on in the 15th century, they had Irish lands. Anyhow, the family, they were first made in the notice of one of the Cornwallises. Thomas Cornwallis was a sheriff of London, but they progressed slowly, bit by bit, up the ranks of the gentry, and then the first one of the Cornwallises, Thomas, was a firm supporter of Charles II during the Civil War when they were in exile. And Thomas since rewarded by receiving a peerage as Baron or Lord Cornwallis. And then, as I say, Cornwallis's father, I should say the Cornwallis family then subsequently become very strong supporters of the Whig government and the the Glorious Revolution of 1688, 1689, and they hoist, their mast to the colours of the revolution. And that serves them very well. As I say, Cornwallis's father eventually becomes an earl, another third stage up in the peerage, and some very useful marital law relations. They're related to the Cornwallises, become related to the Walpoles, the Townshend family, and also Thomas Pelham Hollis, the Duke of Newcastle, who was the sort of wheeler dealer and fixer of the political system in the mid 18th century. So that's the background of Cornwallis, yeah.
So, if his family, a question, if his family is a Whig family, and just getting into his politics for a minute before we talk perhaps a bit about his generalship in the Revolution, was he before he becomes an officer in the British Army in the Revolution, before he's here in America, was he sympathetic at all to the colonial cause, or is he kind of on the opposite page?
Well, he's always written history books that, like the Howe brothers, that he was sympathetic to America. This is based on the fact that he voted against the Declaratory Act, which was passed in 1766. The Ministry of Lord Rockingham wanted to repeal the Stamp Act, but as a political kind of compensation for the hardliners in Parliament, he had to also accompany the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So that's the and now Cornwallis, perhaps because of his Whig principles, I think more because he was friendly with Lord Shelburne, who took exception to the Declaratory Act. Well, he was Cornwallis, Shelburne. They were one of a group of 5 lords who voted against the Declaratory Act, and which obviously was pleasing to the Americans. But after that, Cornwallis shows no sympathies with the American cause whatever. When he is in the House of Lords, he supports, from 1767 really, in the Grafton and North ministries, he supports their actions to curb and try to corral and keep the American colonies firmly in the British Empire. And he certainly voted in favor of, for instance, the Massachusetts Government Act and the Act for the Restraint of the New England Trade in 1774. So he doesn't have any qualms about serving in America, which the Howe brothers certainly did because of their previous family connections with America. Cornwallis, of course, had never been to America, and it wasn't part of his experience.
But what? Are we there? Okay, Richard, I was curious though. Could you tell us a little bit about his military background? What experience does he bring to his command in America? I mean, how does he learn his trade, and is he successful at it? Or
well, good question, Chris. He always wanted to be a soldier. He said to subsequent to his son, Lord Brougham, that he was possessed by an irresistible impulse to be a soldier. His father seems to have decided that just saying, I mean, the usual route for an officer would joining the army, you would join as an ensign or as a cornet, of course, if you're in the cavalry. You would be attached to a regiment, and then you would learn the skill of the art of warring from the officers and, I suppose, senior non-commissioned officers when it came to drill and that sort of aspects of the training. Cornwallis's father decided something better was needed if Cornwallis was to be career was to advance, and decided to send him to an academy in Europe, in Turin, in Italy, a military academy to get a more academic training, in fact. And the one reason for going to the Turin Academy was very much dominated. In fact, although it's in Italy, it was dominated by at least the philosophy of the Prussian army of Frederick the Great. He was seen to be he, rather than the previous French marshals, he seemed to be, his method of warfare, of command, of training, etc., of an army. That was the route to take, and that's kind of interesting because you might say, well, Cornwallis then was only at the academy for 6 months. Then, in fact, he was tipped into the 7 Years' War, where he first of all got a position as an aide to Lord Granby in the British forces in Germany. Then he rapidly, because of his aristocracy, his aristocratic background, and silver spoon in his mouth, he very rapidly became a captain and then a lieutenant colonel within 3 years, which but that was the way the British Army worked. With the aristocracy could further their interest. But but all his training at this point is all about his training is Germanic, and you might say, well, that wasn't a good training background for him for fighting the American War.
Well, one of the things, Cornwallis is probably best known for the 1780-1781 campaign, which is the subject of a new Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours tour going on this October, Chris.
Right. I'm mistaken.
Yes. But one of the things I imagine most people are not aware of is that 5 years before he surrenders to Washington, Cornwallis has a rare opportunity, shortly after the Battle of Trenton, to capture Washington and his army, maybe end the American Revolution. I don't know if it could have done that much, but perhaps back in early 1777. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, the Trenton episode. One has to be frank here that this didn't show Cornwallis in. He was thoroughly outgeneraled by Washington. He was sent down there. Yes, he had a golden opportunity to capture Washington's army, which had come. Washington twice crossed the Delaware, as I'm sure you're aware. Came back, occupied Trenton, or the adjacent creek next to the town of Trenton, appeared to be trapped as Cornwallis arrived with a superior force, much superior in terms of training, expertise, and artillery, etc. And Washington appeared to be trapped, but Cornwallis failed to seal the back of the Sword of Sidles. The one, there was another road leading out of Trent, which allowed Washington to escape. And this was, I think, a very, very serious blot on Cornwallis's. He was lucky not to have his career to be sidelined at that point. But it seems to be he got on well with Sir William Howe, and maybe his luck or whatever. He avoided the consequences that would have followed, I think, many other officers. He was thoroughly outgeneraled. There's no question about that.
Yeah, thank you for saying that twice, because Chris really appreciates that. And
I'm trying to diffuse the situation.
I want to add to that just to really rub it in, Chris, that General Washington employed deception in this instance.
So we had inflatable horses or what?
Large fires that were tended by a few soldiers to make it seem like he was still in camp while he was skulking away to go attack Princeton.
Being
the tricky weasel he was.
He was.
No, it was well executed and a minor miracle.
Well, one of the things that as I read the sad tale of the American War of Independence and British performance in it, that I'm always questioning, and you kind of touch on it a bit in the book. Why do you think it is that the British High Command they seem to lack the killer instinct? They seem to really not get the job done when they should have. What do you think? What were they missing about the American War or the American situation?
Well, I think early on, if you go to the period of command of the Howes, they very much were hoping there would be a reconciliation. They came over with not only commission as admiral and as commander, Sir William, commander of the army, but they were commissioners to establish or negotiate, or at least try and achieve a peaceful accommodation. and I think that led to a certain it kept the sense that if you press the war too, if you're too brutal, then you make reconciliation that much more difficult. I mean, during the Manhattan campaign, the storming when the British captured Fort Washington, some of the British officers there, and Captain Mackenzie, said a lot of them discussed they thought that rather than giving the Americans surrender terms, they should have simply had a massacre. This would have brought the Americans to their senses. But I think the Howes and the higher command were, and Cornwallis was equally, they felt that, above all, force alone might help, but you had to prepare for reconciliation, and just barbarity would not reconcile the population. It would only alienate support. So, sorry, didn't answer your question.
No. Yeah,
What the question was now.
Well, just again, there were moments when the British Army could have put an end to things militarily, and they just seemed to lack that killer instinct. They paused just short.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is that there's a sense of, I mean, certainly you again to look at William Howe, great timidity, really. He's very cautious. Partly it's said that it was because of his concern for the loss of his men, the experience at Bunker Hill, that you had to tread carefully, or you only committed yourself full 100% if you were absolutely sure of what you were and in control of the situation. And so often, I think the British, there was a doubt as to what they were doing, whether they were trying to pursue reconciliation or impose martial law. It was, and then of course from 1778, really, the France coming into the war. A lot of Clinton, Sir Henry Clinton, who is now Commander-in-Chief, part of his army is sent to the West Indies, and the British didn't really have the manpower to win a successful war.
Yeah. But one of the things that strikes me is that Cornwallis is not, he's slow to bag Washington and Trenton, but by the time you get to 1780, the taking of Charlestown, the attack in Camden, South Carolina, the Battle of Camden, in which Cornwallis is very aggressive to attack the forces under Horatio Gates and destroy them, and send Horatio Gates on some 100-mile ride, fleeing his reputation and all shreds of dignity. And he's,
I like that. That was well put.
Thank you. And he also goes on to, I think in some of the other battles that he's involved with, Guilford Courthouse, he's pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
I wonder, he was under Henry Clinton, who was the overall commander, who had gone back to New York. Clinton had talked about, I really ought to just give this up and let Cornwallis run the whole deal. A counterfactual question there would be, would the revolution be any different if Cornwallis had taken command of all the forces in North America sometime in the spring of 1780? Would he, now with the responsibilities of being the commander of all the troops in North America, would he have done things differently? Would it have been in a way that might have caused problems for the Americans?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question. As you say, Cornwallis was an aggressive commander, and I think he was clearly, he doesn't actually say so, but he's clearly reacting against the rather lethargic conduct of the war that had typified the Howes, and then Clinton too, although, as I say, Clinton was starved of somewhat of resources. But yes, if maybe if he'd been appointed in 1778, say, I think he wouldn't have been sitting around. And this was, of course, why he was so disgusted in 1781, when Clinton did expect him to become a stationary spectator or participant in the decision to fortify Yorktown. He wanted a war of a movement. As you say, he wanted and did take the war to the enemy. And I suppose his strategy, he and Clinton, after 1770, 1778, their main strategy seems to be that if they could defeat the continental forces of Washington and, in Cornwallis's case, Greene's army in the south, if they could destroy the Continentals, rout them and disperse them, then perhaps that would be the key to victory. The Loyalists would then start coming out again, which they hadn't done for 4 years, coming out in large numbers to embrace the crown, the cause of the British,
So one of the things that I was really kind of found fascinating in the book was your discussion of how Cornwallis kind of finds himself at Yorktown. It seems like he's not really thrilled about the location of the position. So I guess this is a two-part question. One is, if you could just explain a little bit about how he finds himself there. And is it more his decision, or is Clinton really the one that should bear the weight of responsibility for what's about to happen?
Well, I think Yorktown itself, Clinton certainly bears the principal responsibility. I mean, there's a question mark. Well, Cornwallis marched into Virginia. I mean, I think this was partly driven by what you were saying, Rick, that Clinton had been building forces up in Virginia in 1781, and Cornwallis saw that if he could, as taking control of those in Virginia, and more and more he felt that Virginia was the key to at least the South and maybe the middle colonies too, so that he could fight an aggressive war. And I mean, to some extent, he certainly he broke his orders. He ignored his orders, which were principally to make sure the Carolinas or South Carolina was secure before he embarked on further military operations. But I think it is driven by his desire to conduct an aggressive war. What he overlooked, of course, was that Virginia, when he moved into Virginia in May 1781, that New York was much closer to Virginia than it had been in the Carolinas, and Clinton began to assert his control over his lieutenant and his deputy. And Clinton, Clinton has various notions about what to do in Virginia, but then in July, he has part of his thinking is that we need a decent naval base there, but he was further persuaded to the idea that a major base should be, a naval facility should be provided, because the Navy itself wanted a facility in Virginia, because the Navy didn't like New York as its principal harbor, because the sandbanks at the entrance to New York Harbor wrecked the keels of the big ship, and also it was prone to freezing. And there had been a ferocious frost 1779, just as the Clinton and Cornwallis were departing, just after they departed for the south. There was a horrendous cold spell, and the ice around New York was solid enough to bear the weight of cannon. So this made them very vulnerable to partisan or to Patriot attacks. So an ice-free port, which, with no sandbars and a nice depth of water, somewhere in Virginia would suit the Navy fine. And Clinton agreed to this, and that's why he then tells Cornwallis, find a suitable place, and suggests Yorktown, or he also mentioned Williamsburg, without realizing that Williamsburg...
It's really hard to pull a ship into Williamsburg. Chris, can I ask one more Revolution question before we move on?
Sure. Well, I know we have some questions from the guests too. So
you want to bring in a question from a guest?
Well, no. Ask your question, and then we'll go ahead with some of the.
Well, I was going to say that, of course, Cornwallis ends up with his troops in Yorktown, and we have someone who asks about, could the U.S. have prevailed in a siege of Yorktown without the French? I don't think there would have been a siege of Yorktown without the French, would be my answer to that, although I can let our guest work on that as well. The fact that the French fleet comes in and basically knocks out the British fleet in the Battle of the Capes, kind of dooms Cornwallis in Yorktown, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes. The French presence, and it's not just the French Navy; it's the French Army too. The forces that were at Yorktown on the Allied side was there were 8,000 Virginians and Continentals, and almost about 8,000 French regular troops. And of course, one have to say the Americans, yes, half of them are Virginians. They're militia. They're not as experienced or as trained. They do useful work. Yeah. Because I get some protests from any Virginians in the audience, but the way and
You're
then
a long ways away, so you're probably safe.
well, I think so. And also, of course, the 4,000 Continentals were highly disciplined. Yeah. As equal, of course, of the British, or the French. But even on the land forces, the weight really is tilted to the French contributions. The French also provide the artillery train. They had brought a major train over them in 1780 when they arrived in Rhode Island. And then, of course, you've just got, the 20,000, 25,000, I'm not quite sure the exact figure of sailors on the French ships, providing, helping to get the supplies and move the troops and everything down the Chesapeake that were coming, Rochambeau and Washington, as they were coming down from the north. So there would have been no Yorktown without the French, because the British then, Cornwallis would have had the forces to take on the Americans, or even if Washington had arrived with, Washington wouldn't have marched south, but for the fact that he was going to be
right. He was going to
huge support. Yeah, I'm planning to write an article on this, hoping to write an article on this very point. Yeah.
Chris.
Oh, so okay, so the worst happens, and.
Yes.
No. You must misunderstand history. The best happens.
Oh,
but go
on. Well, go on. Thank you. This surrender leads to the inevitable end of the war. And what is so? We kind of talked about it a little bit, but obviously it would be easy to lay the blame at Cornwallis's feet. But he goes back. What's his reaction? What's the reaction of the British public, the monarchy, to Cornwallis when he does go back?
Well, he was expecting, he was extremely nervous as to what sort of reception he would get. But because he very nearly got swept into France. His ship he was sailing on was captured by Britain. Anyhow, he ends up, as soon as he lands in Plymouth, near Plymouth, to his surprise, people start ringing church bells and coming out onto the streets to wave. And I think in some way, so there seems to be a very large, substantial upsurge of public support for the defeated general. And I suppose maybe this was in a way and a sort of act of defiance of they were not going to kick their own general down, or at least. And he got this reputation for being a dynamic commander. His troops, his officers, always pretty much most of them spoke well of him, were enthusiastic. There were very, very few critics. And in fact, one of the senior officers, Charles Grey, noted that almost no one, Grey himself was about the only person who hadn't sort of bent the knee to the goal, to the great British hero. Who had lost the battle, but in such noble circumstances.
But that's kind of unusual for that time, isn't it? You would have thought.
Well, you would have thought so, but I think, as I said earlier, that the public anger then switched to the ministry, and even the king for allowing the nation to get involved in this.
Could you make a comparison? I haven't thought this all through, but could you make a comparison with Douglas MacArthur, who, he loses an American army in the Philippines, but then he's regarded as a hero, awarded the Medal of Honor, et cetera, et cetera. We need a hero, and you're it.
And in adversity, he was our man, and he did his best. But he was betrayed by others. but in some way you might say it's still inexplicable. But no one. But if they were looking for a military hero, who else was there? They were not going to come out and welcome Sir Henry Clinton,
Right.
or any of the other,
Or the Howe brothers, or
the Howe brothers. Yes, they really were under a cloud, and in fact they'd asked for a court, well, at least a parliamentary inquiry to clear their names because they felt their reputation was besmirched. And maybe because Sir William Howe, well, as I say, he had the best opportunity, apart from Cornwallis at Trenton. Overall, Howe had failed to deliver. Mm-hmm.
So in the history of Britain, for Lord Cornwallis, he's a blip in the North American campaign compared to the 7 years that he spends as general and commander-in-chief in India, where he fights a war, is involved in various other activities. He actually, as you pointed out, he is considered so indispensable that even after he comes back, as towards the very end of his life, when he's near the end of his life, they're like, you got to go out again to India, and he ends up, and he's buried in India. He's buried in a tomb on the Ganges River, which I was just blown away by. But so give us that 7 years in in a minute or two or three. What is he doing in India? Why does that turn out to be so successful for him?
Well, the background, of course, to India was that there'd been a great deal of unease about the East India Company and its administration of India, which was British, was concentrated above all in the Bengal region. As a result of the success of the East India Company in the previous war, they'd got these vast territories in northern India, and some, of course, in the south, and Madras and Bombay. But they brought these back. These East Indian nabobs were coming back with vast fortunes and were buying up parliamentary constituencies, and there was considerable jealousy and envy. But I think there was another strand in public opinion that, and this is sort of European-wide as a result, perhaps, of the Enlightenment, the sense that government can't just be a plaything of the beck and call simply of the elites. That governments must provide something more, protection and property and lives, etc., for the general population, the welfare of the general population, however limited that might be. And so that even the great despots of Europe are saying, they are benevolent despots. They're governing for the interests of all the people. So there's a sense that there must be reform. East India was full of corruption, of rapacious exploitation of the Indian subcontinent, and this had to be corrected. So Cornwallis is given three essential missions. The first one is to go out as Governor General, appointed by the government rather than by the East India Company, but to reform the East India Company's practices, to make it much more, cut out waste, yes, because the company was losing money. It was starting to lose money for the stockholders, many of whom were in Parliament. The company's losing money, and yet there's these vast fortunes coming back, private individuals. So he's sent out to clean up the Augean stables. And so that's one of his main missions. The second mission is to with the landed classes to provide a more stable income that could be regulated, which could be beneficial for both sides. The company would know how much income it was getting. The landowners in India would be assured that their rents were not going to be ever increased. They would be a fixed final permanent settlement. And then finally, it was also sent out to make some at least modest changes. To the judiciary, at least in the sense of providing, enabling the Indian landowners and property holders to seek or take legal action, or to protect their lives and their liberties and their property, because there were been a lot of complaints that, again, the company, of course, was just running rampant over the Indian territory and lands and possessions, etc. So there are those three things. And in many ways, he's very successful on the first point. He does cut out pretty much. I mean, this is something that's also happening in Britain as a result after the American War, the what was called economical reforms to the government, that officials officers must have a useful function. You just couldn't keep filling these offices like the Clerk of the Pells, which was a medieval office that everyone had forgotten what he was supposed to do, the Clerk of the Pells, but was still getting a huge salary. So it's that kind of reform which Pitt is pushing through, and that Cornwallis pushes through very equally firmly in India, reforming the bureaucracy and setting the ground really for the Victorian civil service, which whatever its other, it was was uncorrupt, was not corrupt, was efficient, So,
I mean, I know it's probably a hard question to answer,
Mhm.
but I'm curious. Do we know anything about what his attitudes were towards the Indians, or what the Indians' attitude was to him?
well, it has to be admitted that his attitude to the Indians was he didn't find them most attractive people.
Hmm.
He did feel that they were not entirely trustworthy. That they were either, if you gave them positions of responsibility, they would either be feathering their nests, or they would carry their instructions out beyond what was reasonable and sensible. He didn't feel they could be trusted with all the machinery of government. So that's clearly, he says that Indians, they could run businesses. Indeed, they were running banks and other sophisticated things like that. But when it came to government, they shouldn't be trusted with high positions in the executive. And of course, there was no place for a legislature in the East India Company structure. So it's not a very, you have to say that it's not a very high picture. How did the Indians respond to him? Well, it's difficult to say how genuinely. I mean, when he came back from defeating Tipu, there were addresses to him, including addresses from the inhabitants, the inhabitants of Calcutta, praising that their lives and their liberties were now protected
And we
because
should
of the reforms he carried out. But just how
and we should say defeating Tipu being the leader of a country adjacent to where India controlled Bengal, and there was essentially a border war that goes on there for a while that Cornwallis is leading troops in. It's actually the third
Mysore War.
the third Mysore War, and it is not until the fourth Mysore War that is all solved out. So he's there in India, but he seems to come home. He does seem to have this attitude, I have to say, throughout and throughout his time in India and everywhere else. This kind of like Eeyore, if you know Eeyore, the character from a children's book, who's grumpy about everything. Well, if that's what I have to do, I'll do it. And there does seem to be this sense of Cornwallis is always like, well, they want me to do this, and I don't really want to, but I'm going to do it. Is he just complaining? Is that just a style of complaint of the early 19th century or late 18th century, or is he really, feeling like I'm not really in this for the money or the power or the glory? I'm just kind of doing my duty. How much of that is real?
Well, I think he has a very strong sense of commitment to his country, to his king, of duty, and he's constantly saying that. My impression is that, and he's not saying this just to ministers; it's to to his colleagues or his family or his brother, the Admiral, Admiral Cornwallis, that duty and honor, integrity. I think they are deeply in his core of his being. To go back to the war with Tipu, he was very reluctant to get involved in that conflict because it was going to undo all the economic savings, all the reforms. Wars are expensive, and his attempts to bring the East India Company back into balance or making a profit, all that effort would be thrown. And he's saying that to his brother, the younger brother, who was a bishop of Lichfield of Coventry. Emphasizing, underlying all my endeavors and labors to get the ship of state here are going to be undone. So he didn't want to get into the war with Tipu, but he felt that Tipu had neglected or refused to agree to a commission. To the dispute about the war originated in a little dribbling dispute over some Dutch islands which Tipu claimed. And then he attacked an ally of the East India Company. And it was at that point that when he attacked rather than taking up Cornwallis's offer of a commission to decide the dispute, that Cornwallis feels an ally of the company has been attacked. Our reputation in India will be fundamentally weakened. We have to take action. I must say, this is not just the British that take action against Tipu. Tipu had a lot of enemies in southern India, particularly the Maratha in central or northern India, and the Nizam of Hyderabad. These major Indian princes of independent states, they've had issues with Tipu, and so Cornwallis forms a sort of tripartite alliance to carry the war and to bring Tipu to a heel. So it's not the traditional, typical sort of gung-ho, imperialist adventure that you might get the impression. He was reluctant to go there, and when he did, it was with Indian allies, and he was very insistent that any peace settlement, his allies would get as much compensation from Tipu as Britain did, as the company did.
So whose turn is it, Rick?
I think it's yours.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the things that there was lots of little moments in this book that really I kind of dived into. I was really interested in. And one of them, again, because it was so important, is his time in Ireland. And we don't have lots of time to get into it, but I think it's important that we discuss why he finds himself in Ireland, what he gets involved in, and what an impact he has there, because it's pretty huge.
Yeah. Well, there's this Ireland have been causing concern for British politicians for 20 years, feeling that things were not as they ought to be. And then you get their fears are confirmed when there's this big uprising by the Catholics and a lot of the Presbyterian Protestant inhabitants of Ireland in 1798. During the 1790s, as the war with the French had revealed, there were a significant absence of competent generals. And the cabinet just naturally turned to Cornwallis and said, could you go? And also the then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Pratt, was also Lord Camden, sorry, his surname is Pratt, was desperately calling, why don't you send Cornwallis? I don't feel competent. I don't trust my generals. We must have Cornwallis. And so Pitt says, all right, well, better send him over. And now he goes over with a joint mission of not only pacifying the country, but because of the British were so uneasy about the relationship of the Kingdom of Ireland and the Kingdom of Great Britain, the proposal is that the event should lead to a union of the two kings, a legislative union of the two kings. They're already the two parliaments should be merged into one. They were already, of course, under the common rule, the crown, of the British crown. So it's a twin part munition. Now he arrives really just as the rebellion is being put out by the generals already on the spot. So most of his 3 years as Governor General, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, is spent implementing the Act of Union. What I think is particularly interesting is, and surprised me, just how right from the start, and even before he went out, he was effectively known that he would be sympathetic to the Catholic population, rather than the existing sort of Anglican, Anglo-Irish elite, the Church of Ireland, which is, of course, the Church of Ireland is the same as the Church of England in its ideal and doctrine, etc. He's very much committed to, and says right from the start, really, that if the Union is to succeed, if we are ever to make the Irish good citizens or good subjects of the Crown of the United Kingdoms, there must be very significant concessions for Catholics. And indeed, the best thing would be emancipation, remove the penal laws, and allow the middle class Catholic population to participate in the political system.
Because they couldn't, just for clarity's sake, at that point, many couldn't vote. No one could run for or hold office if you're Catholic. And this was also a position that was very firmly held by George III, that he wasn't going to rule over a country where you allowed Catholics to run for office, that wasn't going to happen, because he felt that you should have one church, one country, and that was it. Cornwallis is, in a way, kind of going against the grain of what his king is looking for there, which is kind of unusual, or would seem unusual to me for a person of that class.
Well, I think this is an indication that Cornwallis was his own man. Maybe came to a conclusion or studied something, or he would stick to his principles, even whether the king was opposed. But I mean, George III said right at the start, there must be no more concessions for Catholics, and Lord Cornwallis had better concentrate on union. But overlooking that the two were inextricably, if the union was to be a success. Of course, attitudes in Britain were beginning to change. There was a groundswell, again, I think, because of these wider intellectual movements in Europe, the Enlightenment, recognition that, and of course, Adam Smith was utterly condemned the Irish situation, that a state based on bigotry could not be successful, could not be justified economically or politically or morally. So there's a lot of people, at least among intellectuals, and I think wider, that really Britain needed to be moving to much wider religious toleration rather than just sufferance, and that these obstacles, and there were several acts passed beginning to nibble at the because it's also the Presbyterians, the dissenters who are also shackled with milder but still significant restrictions on their role in their position in society and in the political world.
Chris, you want to ask?
I was going to say, this is actually a question that Luke Williams had asked earlier, and I thought, there you go. We wanted to get it in the right spot. If Wellington, Marlborough, and Slim are the pinnacle of British Army generalship, how does Cornwallis compare to them? And I would just add to that, where does he kind of fit into that cast of characters?
Yeah, well, that's quite a challenging question.
You saved it for the end. Thank you, Luke.
I think he didn't, in terms of doctrine, well, he was fighting in such diverse situations and areas that it's difficult to say quite where he stands in the pantheon as a military command. But I think even in America, I mean, he did a great deal in Carolinas with very few troops. In India, he proved to be a very effective, both a kind of Marlborough figure with both political and diplomatic responsibilities, and bringing a a very large, but yeah, and otherwise, but of course, so much of his career is not military, really; it's administrative. So it's difficult to put him into the pantheon of. I suppose you could read all whatever it is, 12 volumes of 15 volumes of Sir John Fortescue's history to find out where Cornwallis stood as of.
If you can start reading it to us now, we'll all listen.
But it's a good. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, they're so diverse. Slim,
Right. Yeah.
Marlborough. Who was the other one?
Slim.
Wellington.
Oh, Wellington. Yeah,
Wellington Slim.
Yeah.
And Wellington, he was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was in his regiment, right?
He was indeed.
He was Cornwallis's subordinate. Did they have a relationship?
Well, not a great deal. Cornwallis, only really I've got information there is that Cornwallis did send in a letter to Sir John Shaw in India, because Wellington was going out with the regiment, 33rd Regiment, and said he was a very intelligent, effective, efficient, and would be a useful addition to the military establishment. He wouldn't cause Shaw any difficulties. But of course, this is, impossible to. I don't think Cornwallis didn't detect the greatness that anyhow came to Wellington. But he certainly thought he was he wouldn't have had him as Lieutenant Colonel, I think, unless he'd been favorably impressed with them. And Wellington later said, when someone questioned something about his administration, he said, no, the administration of his regiment, this is, I'm talking about the 33rd Regiment, everything, I haven't changed really anything 30 years before, as laid down by Lord Cornwallis, so fit for purpose. So the two men were very much I think in a similar framework, mindset.
Richard Middleton, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about Lord Cornwallis, who appears, that's the Copley portrait, but he appears headless on the cover of your book, as we discussed, which is called Cornwallis, Soldier and Statesman in a Revolutionary World. And we appreciate your joining us today on the program.
Very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It was great.
Talking to you guys. Yeah.
Cheers.
Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lord Cornwallis. So yes, I mean it is proof that you can screw up or appear to have screwed up and get by it. So that is good news for us.
Wow,
Chris.
a little editorial. Yes, it is. It's very
good news for us. Next week, our topic is something that would no doubt displease Lord Cornwallis.
So we're just going to keep the punishment will continue, huh?
Yeah. The beatings will continue until the morale improves. Yeah. We have, our guest is Eric J. Dolan. He's author of the book Rebels at Sea, The Forgotten Story of American Privateers in the Revolution. Privateers being, if you look at it one way, daring freelance captains who are helping the cause, or if you look at it another way, you could say they were pirates. Which is probably how
Outlaws.
Lord Cornwallis thought of them. But that is our show next week it's not quite Revnov again, Chris, but we do have two Revolutionary War shows in a row before we will get back to World War II and such. So anyway, excellent. Good talking about this with you, and safe travels to you in Luxembourg and Germany.
Thank you. Be safe, everybody. See you all soon.